So true to form, for someone who sought a life of perfect solitude, St. Bruno in large measure has disappeared from history. All that we have of his are two short letters, one to his friend, Ralph Laverde, calling him to make good on his vow to join Bruno as a fellow hermit, and another one written from Calabria a few years before his death, a letter written back to his community in France. Bruno's contemporaries aren't much help either. Only one fellow named Guigo I, which is a great name, has something to say. Guigo was one of the early priors at the Grande Chartreuse, the home monastery near outside of Grenoble, France. So Guido was the fifth prior of that community. And he leaves us just a few short words as a biography of St. Bruno. Master Bruno of the German nation, he was born in Cologne. Born into a well-known family in the city of Cologne, very learned in secular arts and theology, canon of the Church of Rheims, the primatial episcopal see of Gallia, France, and master of the cathedral school. Founded the hermitage of Chartreuse after renouncing the world. He presided over it for 6 years. Then Pope Urban II, one of his former pupils, requested him to join the papal curia so that he might aid him with counsel and support. As he was unable to sustain the chaotic conditions of the papal court, same then as now, he left it to follow his yearning for the solitude he had lost. He renounced the Archbishopric of Reggio, to which the Pope wished him to be selected, and he withdrew to the hermitage of La Torre in Calabria. Although numerous lay and clerical persons crowded around him, he lived his ideal as a hermit until his death. About 11 years after he left France, he died in 1101 and was buried in La Torre in Calabria in the south of Italy. Friends, from the look of it, Bruno had no intention of founding a monastic order. As Guigo mentions, he was head of the cathedral school in Rennes. Now, for much of the medieval period, monasteries served as the great centers of education. We can think, for instance, of St. Anselm of Canterbury making the journey to study with Lanfranc at the monastery of Bec. And having said that, I realize it's probably only for my wife and me that that's like a point of reference. You know, oh, Anselm journeying to study with Lanfranc at Bec. Anyway, but that was in the year 1060. In that same generation, the center of gravity was already beginning to shift to the cathedral schools. In a generation or two, we'll find Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas and others centered around the University of Paris, which was really just an outgrowth of the cathedral school of Notre Dame. So Bruno's position as head of the school in Rennes meant that he was one of the most accomplished theologians and teachers of his generation. It might be a bit of a stretch, but we can compare him perhaps to a young St. Augustine, who held the chair of rhetoric in Milan, the most prestigious academic post of its day. So what happened? How did Bruno go from there to the lonely hills outside of Grenoble? Well, friends, it turns out that if the new bishop at the cathedral where you work has a nasty habit of selling ecclesiastical offices, and if he seizes and sells all the property of you and your brother priests, and if you then write to the Pope and convince him to give the bishop the boot, things get pretty ugly at the next faculty meeting. And so in 1080, while the corrupt Bishop Manasses was still at full tilt, the cathedral canons, the priest at the cathedral in Rennes, fled the city and went into hiding. Bruno would later write of this time in exile to his friend Ralph. You remember, that's the Carthusian in Austria, the Carthusian Maria Tron, the Carthusian monastery of Mary the Throne of Wisdom. Anyhow, you remember, says Bruno to Ralph Laverde, the time you and I and Fulco Le Borgne, and by the way, these fellows, these are all nicknames. So Ralph Laverde is Ralph the Green, and Fulco here is Fulco the One-Eyed, but it sounds a little more dignified to call him Fulco Le Borgne. So you remember when you, Fulco, and I were together in the little garden adjoining Adam's house, where I was staying at the time. We had been discussing for some while, as I recall, the false attractions and ephemeral riches of this present life, and comparing them to the joys of eternal glory. As a result, we were inflamed with divine love, and we promised, determined, and vowed to abandon the fleeting shadows of this world at the earliest opportunity, and to lay hold of the eternal by taking the monastic habit. It seems that Bruno never again took up his post at Rennes. Instead, he journeyed to Grenoble, where Bishop Hugh, later Saint Hugh, welcomed Bruno, made him a grant of land, and accompanied him on a journey into the rugged Massif Chartreuse of the French Alps. Right. No one's going to find you there. And so there, with 6 companions, Bruno began to live a unique form of monastic existence. And as we heard, after a brief interruption in which he was called to the papal court, Bruno continued his monastic existence in Calabria until the time of his death in 1101. Now, the community that Bruno founded, or better, the community that grew up around him, he didn't aim to start a new community. While they were influenced by the rule of St. Benedict, they weren't properly what we call a cenobitic community. They weren't a regular monastic community so much as a collection of hermits. Neither, though, was their way of life what you would call anchoretic. They weren't sort of lonely recluses like St. Anthony of Egypt hiding by themselves in the desert. By one measure, then, you could say that they sat somewhere in the middle. They're a community of hermits. I know that's an oxymoron. That's counterintuitive, but the communal structure of the Carthusians isn't a concession to the difficulties of being alone. It's not like, we'll be a hermit, but just kind of, we'll stay together. It's not a concession to being alone. Rather, so by one measure, you could say that Bruno and his companions sat somewhere in the middle, neither purely cenobitic, not a community, and neither strictly anchoretic, not these lonely hermits by themselves in the wilderness. But what I want to suggest is that this organization is actually a means for augmenting and protecting and nourishing the solitude and the silence of the monks. How's that? Remember that when we speak of monastic silence, we mean much more than just the absence of noise, although that's part of it. Monastic silence is the root and ground of contemplative prayer. It is born of a solitude that is both stable and disciplined. And so by joining men in a generations-long common endeavor and by holding them accountable to a very austere way of life, the Carthusian rule provides this stability and this discipline. Precisely by being a community of hermits, the Carthusian life is a training in perfect solitude, a training in perfect silence. Now, what's going to occupy the rest of the talk here is this question of what exactly is silence and how does it contribute to the life of holiness, the growth in holiness. But before we do that, I want to just give you a little bit of a picture of what the Carthusian life actually looks like. Because this ideal of solitude and silence is on very clear display in the way that the monasteries are arranged and, as you'll see, in the schedule that the Carthusians keep. And so here's a picture of Le Grand Chartreuse, the same one from France. And you'll notice on the left side there, it looks like a whole row of townhouses, right? Looks like something would pop up just off campus here. But anyway, the Carthusian monasteries are unique in that while they have a central church, the sort of the inner sanctum or the heart of the monastery is this collection of individual hermitages. And it's in these that the monk will spend 19 hours a day by himself. Or by herself. There are 3 communities of female Carthusians as well. So you see it here in the main charter house in France. This again is the one in Austria. I had to sneak that in twice. This one's no longer a Carthusian monastery. This was the campus of where I went to grad school. So I got to pretend to be a Carthusian for a while. Didn't stick. But anyway, all these homes that you see, which are now just homes in the community, these are the individual hermitages around the main church of the community. Here again is one from Valsainte in Switzerland. Is a nicer view again, the row of cottage hermitages. Or the last one from Port in France, right there. You get the idea. So again, the inner sanctum is this collection of individual hermitages where they spend roughly 19 hours a day. What do you do for 19 hours a day alone in your hermitage? All right, well, buckle up. Here we go. 11:30 p.m., get up. That already doesn't make sense, right? Just as a side note, remember that prior to the Industrial Revolution, our sleep cycle was I don't know what the right word is. We went through 2 sleep cycles in a night, and so you would naturally have this kind of witching hour, this hour of being awake. And really with the demands of the Industrial Revolution and everyone getting to work on time at a certain hour, we collapse that into one long stretch. But some of the monastic communities still reflect this more natural sleep cycle. And so they get up in the middle of the night. So rise, prayer in cell. And then at 12:15, prayer in the chapel, which lasts for 2 to 3 hours depending on the day or feast. Followed by more prayer in your cell. Praise to God with the Virgin Mary, then back to sleep. 6:30, get up. The time is approximate. Be ready for prime. 7 o'clock, prime, that's the first office of the day, right, first part of the breviary. And so you have prime and the Angelus, and then Mass. Then back in the cell for spiritual reading, for Lectio Divina. Then terce, another monastic hour. Then manual work, prayer, meal, brief amount of recreation. Then at 2 o'clock, that's non, not none, as in the next monastic office. Then work, then prayer again. At 4 o'clock, then 4:15, guess what? Prayer again. Then Lectio Divina again. Then at 6:45, the Angelus, Compline. 7:30, benediction, bedtime, not benediction. 7:30, bedtime. You're down by 8, and you're back up at 11:30 to run the cycle again. And with the exception of a common walk on Sundays, this is the cycle day in and day out your entire life. The Carthusian motto sums this up well. It's always this picture of the earth with the cross on top and the words, stat crux dum volvitur orbis. The cross stands while the world turns. The cross is that point of constancy around which the monks are gathered while everything else happens around them. The cross stands while the world turns. Stat crux dum volvitur orbis. Okay. There was a documentary made about the Carthusians in 2005 called Into Great Silence. And it did a beautiful job of portraying the life of the monastery. It basically just followed them around, and much of the movie, all 3 hours of it, are just in silence. I want to show you a clip, but you can understand how a movie like this doesn't really lend itself to a highlight reel, right? So there's no like quick 30 seconds. It's a long clip. It's about 8 minutes long, but I want it to be long to help us to get into the feel of the Carthusian monastery. And what you're going to see is a novice, a new member of the community being vested, so being given his habit, then being welcomed by his brother monks. You'll see them embrace. And then they're going to process with the new monks to their individual hermitages. And we'll see in the final moments there the prior, the head of the community, saying a prayer over Dom Marie Pierre, the new monk. And it's the words of this prayer which will then sort of tease out in the rest of the talk. So here we go. That's the wrong one. There we go.
Que demandez-vous? Miséricorde.
Levez-vous.
Je demande, pour l'amour de Dieu, à être admis à l'approbation sous la vie monastique comme le plus humble serviteur de tous, si vous, mon révérend Père, et la communauté le jugez bon.
Chers Étienne et Benjamin, je demande donc à chacun de vous, êtes-vous prêts à embrasser notre forme de vie monastique comme le chemin par lequel Dieu vous va guider vers le sanctuaire intérieur de votre âme, où il désire vous révéler sa présence et vous faire vivre de sa communion.
J'espère satisfaire à tout cela dans la mesure où la bonté divine me l'accordera.
Je me confiant uniquement dans l'amour de Dieu et les prières de mes frères, j'espère satisfaire à tout cela dans la mesure où la bonté divine me l'accordera.
Sachez, chers frères, qu'avant la profession, vous gardez la liberté de vous retirer, et que de notre côté, nous avons également la liberté et le droit de vous renvoyer si nous ne pensons pas que vous êtes apte à notre genre de vie. Êtes-vous d'accord?
Oui, mon révérend Père.
Approchez-vous alors pour le baiser de paix. Au nom de Dieu et celui de l'ordre, en mon nom propre et celui de tous mes frères de cette communauté, je vous accueille dans la communion de l'ordre. Seigneur, prends pitié.
Ô Christ, prends pitié.
Seigneur, prends pitié. Sauve ton serviteur, ô mon Dieu,
Il s'appuie sur toi.
de ton sanctuaire, Seigneur, envoie-lui ton secours.
Les hauteurs de Sion soutiennent.
Sois pour lui une forteresse imprenable,
Un bastion face à l'ennemi.
que l'ennemi ne puisse le surprendre.
Et que le traître ne puisse le renverser.
Seigneur Dieu de l'univers, ramène-nous vers toi.
Montre-nous ton visage et nous serons sauvés.
Prions le Seigneur. Accorde à ton serviteur, Seigneur, le don de persévérer dans sa marche à la suite du Christ, pour qu'il donne le témoignage de l'amour fraternel et parvienne à la plénitude de la vie évangélique. Par Jésus le Christ notre Seigneur.
Amen.
Dom Marie-Pierre, vous avez désormais à mener fidèlement la vie de cellule et à suivre les autres observances de notre ordre. Ainsi, vous vous rendrez disponible pour Dieu seul, dans la solitude et le silence, en une prière ininterrompue et une joyeuse pénitence. Je vous confie au Père Maître, qui vous visitera aux moments opportuns et veillera à votre formation.
I wanted that to be long. It was. At the end of the scene, we hear the prior say, Dom Marie-Pierre, from this moment on, you will live in your cell and follow the rules of your order, of our order. And then, let me say it in French, ainsi, vous vous rendez disponible pour Dieu seul, dans la solitude et le silence, en une prière interrompue et en joyeuse pénitence. I want to leave it in French. It reminds me of that New Yorker cartoon where you have the man sitting there translating the works of Dickens into French. And his wife says, honey, what are you doing? He says, I'm putting it into French. It loses something in the original. You know, so it sounds more noble in French. But also because I want to tease out the words a little bit individually, and then at the end we'll sew that sentence together. The first word is silence, silence. Now we have a letter from Bernard, the first prior of the Carthusian monastery of Port. It's actually a painting of Bernard there. It's from the early 12th century, not long after the death of St. Bruno, and it's one of the oldest writings in the Carthusian tradition. Bernard writes to a fellow named Renaud, a reclusive monk. Whenever circumstances allows, he begins, you must constantly seek to preserve silence, especially during the night. Silence must be preserved unless some necessity forces an interruption. It is, he goes on to say, your duty to adhere to this advice because it is written in Holy Scripture. The Lord says in the Gospels, but I tell you that everyone will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word that they have spoken. Further, it is written, sin is not ended by multiplying words. And also this, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Or again, if we can add to Bernard a little bit, we might recall St. James teaching that the tongue is a fire, tameless, restless, full of poison. Now, if we leave it at this, we get the impression that silence is a matter of avoidance, of steering clear of empty and restless words. That's an admirable task, but the whole Christian tradition understands the desert not as a refuge, but actually as a place of combat. And the silence of the desert not as an avoidance, so much as an engagement, part of the work of transformation. And indeed, this is what the words of the prior convey. The silence to which he commends the monk is viewed not negatively as an avoidance of evil, but positively as a means for the monk to be disponible pour Dieu seul, to be available, or to be available for God alone, or to be at God's presence alone. It's not a running away, but a running into, right? But how can we understand this idea of being available to God in silence? Cardinal Ratzinger once said very beautifully that prodigality is the law of love, excess. By this measure, what we call the parable of the prodigal son would be more rightly named the parable of the prodigal father. Because the point of the text is that no matter how far the son goes in squandering what he's been given, the mercy of the father actually outstrips that. The father is more prodigal than the son. The silence of the Carthusian life is, in the last instance, best understood as a vigilant and tireless receptivity to divine love and availability to God. It's born of a desire to be with the beloved, to be with God. And for that, you could say even 19 hours in one's cell is not enough. For really, which of us can outstrip the efforts, which of us can outstrip the excesses of divine love, can receive the whole of what God actually wills to give? The silence of the monk is not, above all else, a flight from evil so much as it is a making oneself available to the divine embrace. Only those, writes St. Bruno, who have experienced the solitude and silence of the wilderness can know what benefit and divine joy they bring to those who love them. There, in solitude and silence, one can try to come to a clear vision of the divine spouse who has been wounded by love, to a pure vision that permits them to see God. We see then why the prior describes the monastic life as joyeuse, as joyous. But note that he says more. He describes the life of silence, this life of availability, as joyeuse pénitence, as a joyous penance. Now, what does that mean? Yes, silence is the avoidance of empty words. It's the making of oneself available for joy of the divine embrace, for a vision of the beloved. But how can we understand it as a penance? And here you'll have to forgive me because I hang out most of the time in the Old Testament. I want to take a little detour to Scripture. Although I guess you should never apologize for taking a detour to Scripture as a theologian. But anyway, so forgive me. I want to make a claim that the first chapters of Genesis, this little group 1 to 11, what we call the primordial history, are chapters thoroughly concerned with language and with silence. Here's what I mean. In the first creation account in Genesis 1, we're given this image of God speaking things into existence. God said, "Let there be light." It's an anthropomorphism, of course, but it turns out to be one that's especially fitting for what the text actually wishes to convey. For the chapter is about not just the coming of things into existence, but the granting of order to things, the arrangement of things. We tend to think of Genesis 1 as a chapter about God making stuff, fish, birds, creeping things, but it's equally a text about separating and ordering. Think of the first day, let there be light, and then God separated the light from the darkness, right? The creation story is about the passage from chaos to the ordered, harmonious whole of the sixth day, when God judges all things seen together as very good. In the account, God's words don't, of course, just signify things. They don't announce what's already the case. God's words bring about what they announce. They're efficacious in that way. Now, in one way, our speech is entirely unlike God's. Our words signify, but they don't create. My saying light doesn't make light. If it worked that way, I'd say cheeseburger and nap time a lot more. And my arrangement of words doesn't give order to the world. Instead, if they're true, my words signify the order that's already present. But what's so fascinating, though, is that in another respect, our words are very much like God's. They have the power to reflect the world as it is, but also the power to bring into being a new world. You're sitting in it, you're looking at it, right? Much of what we see in the opening 11 chapters of Genesis is a wrestling with the whole issue of knowledge and speech. Think of this. The opening chapters of Genesis show us a God speaking a world into existence, and these chapters close with our attempt at Babel to create an alternate world, and with God frustrating that attempt. How? by wounding our language, by making us unable to speak, by reducing us to a kind of silence. Language brackets these chapters. The turning point, of course, is those chapters, the chapter of Eden. The moment where we gain knowledge and so, as the text says, become like gods, become capable of speaking not only in a way that reflects the world, but in a way that can generate a whole new existence. Since that power of knowledge and speech does make us godlike, and here's the point. These chapters wish us to keep in mind the possibility that our speech runs counter to the world. To keep in mind the possibility that our speech, that our words might actually occlude our vision of what is real. The possibility that our speech leaves us, to borrow a phrase, in the world of the text, in the world of words. There is the possibility, pardon the pun, it's unforgivable, that we might babble on and create for ourselves a world that doesn't truly exist. That we might construct a vision of ourselves that simply isn't true. Okay, the discipline of silence meets this possibility head on. It's a setting aside of our own words so that we might hear a word that precedes us. Silence is a way of attending not to the world of one's own making, but to what is real, and of listening to what it has to say. The psalmist tells us that the heavens are telling the glory of God and the firmament proclaiming his handiwork. Creation announces itself to the glory of God, announces itself in praise. And yet, notice, the psalmist goes on to say, there is no speech, nor are there words, their voice is not heard. Silence is a language on its own. And those who take up that discipline can join themselves in the praise of which the psalmists speak. They announce the glory of God. But notice this, the surrendering of our word opens an attentiveness to the real, and what it announces includes ourselves as well. The contemplative Jean-Jacques Dupont says, by silence we enter into the muddy abyss of our own being. We enter into what Augustine and Bernard speak of as this regio dissimilitudinis, the region of dissimilarity where we encounter painfully our own brokenness and disfigurement, the whole of the way in which we are not like God. To break from the text for a minute, when we let go of the world that our words create, silence opens the possibility of seeing oneself truly. And whereas a true glance at creation sees it announcing itself in praise to God, a true glance at oneself reveals this region of dissimilarity, this profound unlikeness to God. But equally so, precisely in this encounter of our dissimilarity to God, we encounter God in his mercy. We experience the abiding love of God that wills to heal and to restore and to make alive. If the heavens and the firmament announce straightforwardly the glory of God, our announcement, born of silence, sings God's mercy, and it takes as our own, in uninterrupted prayer, the words of God's own speech, the words of Scripture. In this way, the discipline of silence entails both a suffering, a painful self-awareness, but precisely by the encounter of God and God's mercy therein, it is a painfulness that culminates in joy. It is a joyeux pénitence. It is a joyous penitence. And so taken together, the words of the prior that sort of summarize this monastic life to the novice read as follows. Don Marie Pierre, from this moment on, you will live in your cell and follow the rules of our order. Thus, you will make yourself available to God alone, in solitude and silence, in uninterrupted prayer and joyous penitence. It was, of course, this very task that St. Bruno first took up in 1084. And in his cultivation of a communal life of silence, he modeled for us a habit of joy, a joyous penitence through which so many others have been able to draw near and to embrace God. I leave you now with a few words from St. Bruno, an exhortation to enter in and to seek the silence and to seek God therein. What is more, What is more sound and beneficial, more innate, more in accord with human nature than to love the good? And what is as good as God? Still more, is there anything good beside God? So the holy soul who has any comprehension of this good, of his incomparable brilliance, splendor, and beauty, burns with the flame of heavenly love and cries out, I thirst for God, the living God. When will I come to see the face of God? And let me close just with a few stanzas here of a poem by Matthew Arnold about the Grande Chartreuse in France. Just the last two. Long since we paced this shadowed nave, we watched those yellow tapers shine, emblems of hope o'er the grave, in the high altar's depth divine. The organ carries to our ear in accents of another sphere. Fenced early in this cloistered round of reverie, of shade, of prayer, how should we grow in other ground? How can we flower in foreign air? Past banners pass and bugles cease, and leave us our desert, and leave our desert to its peace. Stat crux dum volvitur orbis. The cross stands as the world turns. St. Bruno, pray for us. Thank you.
Friends, and we do have some time for questions.
Yeah, there are a dozen or so monasteries in France, Spain, Germany, Switzerland, South Korea, Vermont, and Brazil. Yeah. So yes, there's about 400 or so Carthusian monks and sisters. And in 1950, when we had the proclamation of the Assumption, there was a new community founded called the Community of Bethlehem. It's actually called the Community of Bethlehem and the Assumption of Our Lady and of St. Bruno. It's this classic, long religious title. And they take their inspiration from St. Bruno, and they have monasteries in about 15 countries, and they basically live the Carthusian rule with one or two little differences.
I can't help but think of the tradition in Eastern Christian monasticism of skeets and the tradition of St. Pachomius of communities of hermits, and see a similarity with the Carthusian. Was St. Bruno at all influenced by Eastern practices?
Yeah, I mean, the monastic tradition, of course, reaches the West through John Cassian and through Benedict. And at the time of St. Bruno, you have this flowering of people entering the wilderness alone. You have kind of the classic, the gyrovags who are by themselves, they're not locked up in one spot. You have the anchorites as well. And you also have, as a contemporary of Bruno, St. Romuald, the founder of the Camaldolese monks, which is sort of a riff on Bruno's rule. Hermits, so in a Carthusian monastery, everybody in the monastery is a hermit, and they contribute to some sort of common life. In the Camaldolese model, you have a Benedictine monastery and hermits sort of outposted sort of in the wilderness beyond. St. Bruno and the customs of the Carthusians, this piece written by Guigo a couple of decades after his death, will make mention of St. Anthony of Egypt. So we have so little of Bruno, I can't say, well, yes, he's citing Pachomius in this instance, but clearly the example of Antony and then Benedict and the rest is in the background and is formative. Yeah.
What do these hermits and community of hermits consider their purpose of their life, their hope?
There is no separation between love of God and love of neighbor. As the students in my foundations class will remember when we covered the Jacob cycle, the story of Jacob in Genesis, for Jacob to really enter into his position as the elect, it requires Jacob to wrestle with and to be reconciled with Esau. And so anytime you think of an aromatical existence, of someone going out to seek God alone, you'd want to name first the desire to be with the beloved, to have a vision of the divine spouse, right? It's that for which our heart is most longing, and it's in him that we find rest. But precisely thereby, inasmuch as you always are a member of the one body of Christ, the church, you're being joined to the divine spouse, and your constant acts of intercession are really at the service of the whole body. And as an expression of this, there's a little plaque, I'm going to have to paraphrase, but a little plaque on the outside of the Carthusian monastery here. You can't go in. But it said, please respect the silence and the solitude in which we, the members of the Carthusian order, spend our lives in prayer and in sacrifice for you. So this precisely by joining themselves to Christ, strengthening the unity of the body, it's an uplifting of the whole, us included. So,
Since there is so little known, or at least so little written
yeah.
by St. Bruno, it seems like a miracle that he became a saint. Do you have that story, how it actually became a saint?
It wasn't until 1515. It was a long time after his death. He died in 1101. Bruno does sort of fade into history in a way. Bruno doesn't write a monastic rule. He has this community that gathers around him, and a couple decades after his death with Guigo, you have this book about the customs of the charter house of the Chartreuse. But it's not for several centuries more that you actually have a defined and canonically approved Carthusian rule. And so I want to say there's almost like a prestige that doesn't quite attach to Bruno in the way that it would attach to Benedict, who authors the rule, and so on. But nevertheless, throughout the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, these cloistered or sort of reformed monastic orders become, for lack of a better term, the pen pals of everyone in Europe. First, the Cistercians, and then eventually the Carthusians in the 1300s and 1400s. And it's really at that point that Bruno and the Carthusians' fame is sort of on the ascendancy, and then again in the early 1500s he's canonized. But what specifically sort of turns the corner for Bruno, I don't know. Yeah. So,
Anthony.
Yeah. Oh, hey.
Here, can you use the microphone? Thank you.
Just two questions. The Bernard and Bruno are fairly close in time.
Yeah.
What sort of influence did each have on one another? And then my second question is, within the Carthusian community, how many of the monks would take holy orders? And what level of education would be provided for those who are there? Do they just listen to the Lectio Divina, or do they actually have to read it? In which case, if they read it, we would have been very highly educated men at that time. Thank you.
Yeah, so in the second letter of Bruno's, the one that he writes from Calabria back to the Grand Chartreuse, he commends his brothers back in France for keeping their discipline, and he makes this offhand reference of, and though you can't read such and such, you hold to all the examples that have been left to you, and so on. It's clear that education is not part of the curriculum of the Carthusians. Canonically, it's part of the curriculum of the Carthusians now. Of course, everything is done in-house. As far as who takes orders, there's a division in the Carthusians between they're all hermits, but in terms of division of labor, they're the Carthusians proper, who are there 19 hours a day in their cell. Then there's sort of not lower ranks, but two other ranks. The converses, who do most of the manual work sort of in and around the monastery, sort of in the monastery, and then the donés. So if you're feeling up to it after this, you can give yourself over for 7 years as a donate brother. And the donate brothers and the converses don't seek holy orders, but the full-time regular Carthusians all do. Yeah.
Maybe one more question?
How about this guy? That's my brother, Dave. It's the other Dr. Pagliarini.
That's right.
It better not be about mitochondrial genetics.
That's right. We're gonna pivot to biochemistry here.
Yeah.
So Anthony, that was really fun. In the spirit of asking, how do we get better by knowing about these saints? I'm wondering sort of two things. One is, it's impractical for all of us to become Carthusian monks, obviously, but is the message as simple as we need to find time to, like, little bits of these times of silence in our lives to do this? And is there any relation to a lot of the really fascinating social science now about the value of, this more secular things like the value of mindfulness, meditation, and things like this that really show all kinds of very positive health benefits, et cetera?
Yeah, so again, it's impractical for us to become Carthusians, as attracted as I am to that for like increments of 15 minutes at a time. And then I was like, no, I really love my wife and my kids and I want to be exactly here. But man, that's beautiful, right? But you see in a lot of different monastic orders the outcropping of sort of the third orders, right? People who are properly lay people taking the charism of the community and living in the world. So people like St. Catherine of Siena, who was never in a convent, who was a third order Dominican. There is no third order Carthusian, but sort of even absent something formal like that, yeah, I think the message is that we are now, perhaps more than ever in history, awash in words. There's something like, the amount of things published on Twitter last week exceeds the total number of all books, of all letters written in before the 21st century. I mean, we're just awash in words. And so this possibility or this danger, which I think Genesis 1 through 11 really holds up, that we become, we sort of will into existence alternate worlds that really are in conflict with what is truly the real, calls perhaps now more than ever for a period of silence, of not speaking. And even though Katie wouldn't let me go, a full week without saying anything, there certainly are this capacity for, Katie's my wife, the capacity for an hour or whatever it might be. As for how that sort of reflects current sociological research or neurological research, I don't really know, but it's nice to hear it. It seems like it confirms this idea of the value of silence. Yeah.